This is the second part of the video lecture series for the Introduction to Area 2. In this, we're going to discuss in more detail the Group Open Systems model. Again, as a quick review, we'll talk about personal characteristics and individual or situational characteristics as inputs to groups. We'll discuss group structural dimensions and the group processes that are the throughputs. And then finally, we'll discuss the outputs. There are inputs to every system. The two principal inputs to groups are people and situational characteristics. People bring knowledge, skills, abilities of varying levels into groups. Some new members bring limited knowledge, skills, and abilities. Some more experienced members obviously bring higher levels, or hopefully bring higher levels of those. And individuals also bring other characteristics, personalities, likes, dislikes, things of that nature which influence the group. Situational characteristics also influence the group. The task that the group is formed to accomplish obviously affects how the group functions. The space, which typically means the authority or organizational space that the group is provided within which it can accomplish its goal. And then finally, resources. Every group requires some form of resources, equipment, funding, other physical spaces to work in, things of that nature that influence how that group is going to perform. Each group has some dimensions. We call these group structural dimensions, or you can think of them as characteristics. And we'll discuss each of these in a little more detail. There's composition, status, roles, norms, and cohesion. Each group has some form of composition in which we look at individual diversity. Essentially, we look at, is the group heterogeneous or is it homogeneous? A heterogeneous group is, as the name implies, one in which there is diversity among individuals in any number of characteristics. And how important diversity is in different characteristics depends on the task that the group is assigned. Group may be heterogeneous in terms of racial composition, in terms of gender composition. It can be heterogeneous in terms of skill composition. But one thing we know is that complex tasks are best accomplished by groups that are composed of many different types of individuals. And again, the differences or types of differences should relate strongly to the task. But in general, the more heterogeneous the group, the more likely it is to be able to successfully accomplish complex tasks. Of course, the converse of that is also true. That simple tasks are best accomplished by homogeneous groups. It doesn't take a whole lot of innovation or creative thinking if all you have to do is dig a ditch. You just need some strong people with strong backs and provide them some shovels to dig a ditch. Again, that's a very simple task. So you need, again, a homogeneous group. And the homogeneity there is based around the one characteristic of having strong backs. Every group has levels of status for each individual in the group. Obviously, some of those are organizationally defined. In other words, it may be positional based on assignment in terms of a police sergeant or police corporal or whatever the case may be. And there are certain responsibilities and sometimes privileges and authority that go with that. It may be informal in that it's socially defined, but each group will have some pecking order, some hierarchical structure that defines the status of every individual there. Some members will have high status, some members will have medium status, some will have low status. Typically, in many groups, the more experienced, the more competent, the more credible members have higher levels of status. The newer members with lesser degrees of demonstrated competence credibility, may have lower levels of status. But in any social group or task group or formal group, we can, if we watch long enough, can discern the different levels of status. And status is typically conferred or demonstrated through different privileges, different levels of respect, different levels of influence for those individuals. Each individual in a group will have some type of role. Of course, one of those roles is typically organizationally defined. That is the expected role for that individual. And there'll typically maybe some formal statement, a job description, which describes knowledge, skills, abilities, describes duties and responsibilities. Of course, all of us as members of groups perceive our roles, and some of us perceive those more accurately and more consistently with what the organization desires than others. Then, of course, what we actually do in the real world is the enacted roles. Now, roles typically, again, are based on group membership. And recall that when we talked about different types of groups, in particular the formal command groups and task groups, often there will be some conflict, or there may be conflict based upon the roles as defined by those two groups. So that's one of the problems that may occur with roles if there's more than one definition and a person belongs to different groups. Norms are just what the name implies. It's normative behavior. What are the norms of the group? Typically these are behavioral standards, and they generally only relate to matters of significance for the group. And what is significant to the group will vary from one group to another. And of course some of those norms are written, formalized in the form of standard operating procedures, rules, regulations, policies, things of that nature. But there are typically many norms that are informally communicated. And obviously there will be varying levels of acceptance for these norms. And the problem very often that occurs in organizations is when group norms, the informal norms, conflict with or are contrary to formally stated norms. Every group has some level of cohesion, which is typically defined as a commonness of attitude, behavior, and performance. Other people use the metaphor of glue, the glue that binds the members of the group to that group. It's those forces that compel us to stay in a group, and it's typically stronger than the forces to leave the group. Group cohesiveness, of course, can be functional or it can be dysfunctional. We view that from the perspective of whether or not that cohesion contributes to the organization's mission in achieving its goals. Groups can be highly cohesive, but if that cohesion is not focused on accomplishing the organization's goals, then that is dysfunctional rather than functional. There can be problems with group structural dimensions, and typically we look for those problems. Again, we look for any role conflict between informally defined roles and the formally defined roles in the organization. We also can see problems in terms of how individuals define and enact their roles or perceive and enact those roles, which could be contrary to the organizationally desired role. One problem that occurs in terms of status is when status is conferred for reasons that don't support the organization's goals. And we look there at status incongruence. If status is conferred for more strongly for social group membership and conformance to the norms and roles of informal groups, then status is conferred for conformance to and membership in formal command groups or task groups in the organization, then that can be a problem. We see this in police organizations, sometimes typically related to part-time jobs where many members may, in their extra organizational role of controlling part-time employment may have higher status than is typically conferred for someone at that rank or position in an organization. Norms can be dysfunctional. Normative accepted behavior in the group may not help the group or individuals contribute to the organization's goals. So to the extent possible, we want norms in all groups to help contribute to the organization's goals. In terms of task complexity, we want to make sure that we match the composition of a group to the complexity of the task. So if we have a simple task, we just need simply a homogeneous group that typically, again, homogeneity there is defined based upon whatever the task is. If we have a complex task, we want a diverse group. Now, in general, many of the tasks that police organizations and groups in those organizations attempt to accomplish are complex. So we typically, in the complexity, relates to a number of different group characteristics in terms of racial, gender diversity, skill diversity, experience diversity. So we want typically in most police tasks, we want typically a high degree of heterogeneity. And then finally, low cohesion can be a problem, or dysfunctional cohesion can also be a problem. But many organizations, if it's low, it's obviously dysfunctional, and high cohesion can also be dysfunctional if that cohesion isn't focused on accomplishing the organization's goals. Finally, there are group processes that we're going to get into in more detail in each of the lessons associated with those processes. But we're going to look at socialization, the process by which we bring people into the organization and help them learn these roles, help them understand how status is conferred, how it's earned, help them understand the cohesion, help them contribute to cohesion. Finally, we're going to look at cohesion itself, how leaders influence the extent to which a group becomes cohesive. We're going to look at intergroup conflict, one of the outcomes of cohesion and differentiation in terms of groups in organizations is we often create intergroup conflict. Intergroup conflict can be functional in that conflict is necessary to create change, but it can also be dysfunctional in that it can inhibit effective collaboration between groups. And we'll look at how groups develop over time and either become more effective groups or perhaps regress and become less effective groups. Finally, each group produces outputs, and we look at those at the individual, group, and organizational level. There's a great deal of literature that indicates that individuals actually learn more, become more competent in more functional, especially more cohesive groups, in which the roles are more clearly defined, in which status is conferred for appropriate reasons, in which roles are clearly defined and accepted and enacted. We know that individuals are more satisfied and more motivated to perform in groups that are more cohesive. Think back, reflect on our own experiences. Typically some of our best work experiences have been when we've been in groups that were cohesive and highly functional. Finally, we look at groups in which we look at group structural dimensions and the extent to which they might change. Do we see increased cohesion? Do we see dysfunctional cohesion? Do we see roles inappropriately defined, role conflict? And groups perform. Typically, groups are tasked with a given goal or given mission, and the group itself achieves some level of performance. And then finally, we look at the organization. If nothing else, organizational performance is the aggregate performance of all of the groups in the organization. So to the extent that any one group in the organization doesn't perform as well as it could, the organization obviously doesn't perform as well as it could. And in the next video series, we will discuss group development.